Today's show is probably going to be slightly unusual and probably problematic. You'll find out why in a minute. The first person I want to introduce is a guy called Andrew Gough, who you remember he was on the show recently and gave us a fantastic talk about bees and the worship thereof. And I know he's working on the book, so you'll be able to buy that one day. Andrew's website is arcadia.com if you want to go and check him out. But he's one of the researchers that there are on the planet that I deeply respect. His work is incredible, and a lot of it's focused on what a lot of you will know as Rennes-le-Château, the stuff that's Da Vinci Code and the Holy Blood, Holy Grail kind of stuff. My other guest is the one that's probably going to give me trouble. He's Rat Scabies, and you may remember Rat Scabies from the punk rock band The Damned. And Rat Scabies was featured in a book recently, which did very, very well, Rat Scabies and the Holy Grail, which apparently was a little bit Monty Python-esque. I don't know, I'm not told. Maybe Rat will put this right. Rat Scabies and Andrew Gough, thank you very much, pair of you, for coming on the show. There's nothing to break, so we've kept everything away.
You can burn books, though.
You can burn books. There's a Holy Bible there. I mean, I'm surprised it's surviving near you.
A good place to start.
Near the Damned. I mean, I'm intrigued. Just firstly, Rat, why The Damned? And obviously, your parents didn't give you the name Rat Scabies.
Well, the name The Damned came from the John Wyndham book, The Midwich Cuckoos, which was made as a movie called The Village of the Damned. And we wanted to be those kids, but with guitars. And so that kind of, and at the time Visconti's movie The Damned was doing the circuit, which was kind of, Nazi decadence and everything else, which was quite fashionable then. So The Damned just seemed to kind of fit us, and also we were all from broken families and backgrounds. We weren't a happy bunch of well-adjusted people anyway. We were. So the name fitted in kind of a lot of different levels. Right. So that was why we went with it.
And you're intrigued by this Rennes-le-Château mystery, etc.
Well, I grew up with it, is the short answer. My parents were great free thinkers anyway. And, the thing in our house was we were taught to question what we were given as established facts and the norm. Right. And when the Henry Lincoln programme Chronicle came out which was the first sort of unveiling of the Rennes-le-Château mystery, of course, my father took to the subject, tape recorded the programme because, there weren't videos back in those days. So I remember he put a tape recorder with a microphone next to the TV. And then it became the hot topic of conversation in the house for really ever since 1972. Right. So I kind of grew up with hearing this story of this priest, the treasure, the coffin receipts found early, or the coffin being ordered before.
Well, I mean, a lot of people
and all of the cool stuff.
A lot of people that are watching this won't have a clue what Rennes-le-Château is. I mean, so could you give us a bit of a background, because you're one of the researchers that has done such a lot of work in this field. Can you give us a brief outline? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. And I have to say, I first came across Rat, I think it was 78 or 79, Club COD, Chicago, Amber playing, and fantastic. But I didn't really get to know Rat until after the book came out and realized he lives about a mile from me.
Synchronicity.
We get together and have a beer and argue profusely over this whole story. So,
I know.
You had witness to that last night.
That's the point, though.
Well, the beauty of it is it's a story, and I'll give you a summary of it in a moment, that at any given day you can convince yourself it's a complete farce. Yeah. The next day you can convince yourself it might be one of the greatest mysteries of our time. And you kind of alternate between the two. But the story is back in the 1880s and 1890s in the south of France. Go to Carcassonne and drive south about 45 minutes by car. You have a village, and the footsteps, really the Pyrenees, and it's a really obscure place, desolate place. And you have a priest who comes to the village and appears to have discovered something. He writes in his diary on September 21st, 1891, discovered a tomb, at night it rained. And all of a sudden he appears to have a lot of money. More money than a priest should reasonably have. And he begins to renovate the church and village in what is arguably a rather gaudy, bizarre, and potentially esoteric way. So, what did he discover? And what, if anything, did he bring to light that is still being pursued by a number of researchers? So in a nutshell, it's a priest who appears to have uncovered something in his church while renovating it. It could be lineages of importance to various people. It could have been gold from the French Revolution, or the Visigoths, or any number of things, which Rack can give you some more insight.
Yeah, there's quite a lot in there.
Yeah.
Well, you've spent time there, haven't you?
Yeah, as much as I can, really. It's I find it an absolutely beautiful place just to be in anyway. It's the south of France, the weather's good, the food is fine, and the wine's even better, and it's, to go and research and work down in such a magnificent setting. It's a dream come true. But the real thing with the story is that, which is kind of some of the nitty-gritty details, the thing of when Saunière makes this discovery, it's everything that goes with it, the way he suddenly starts mysteriously digging up the cemetery, just changing things, moving stuff around, builds walls around the place. And,
a lot of it seems to be Mary linked as well, doesn't it?
Marie Donano, the reports of there was so much money that she was seeing it, burning it by the wheelbarrow when they changed the French currency at the end of the Second World War.
No, I know this is one of those areas of contention where this money came from.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is that he did have the money. He did buy a third of the village. He did build 2 independent structures. He did renovate the entire church and presbytery. He was extremely generous to the village. And
that's an awful lot for a single priest of a small town.
It's not a town.
A village.
I mean, the population there is not even, then was probably less than 200.
Well, it explains why the streets weren't cleaned when I was there last time.
Well, it's pretty grubby, They don't need to.
So the majority of the researchers would say that he made his money from the sale of masses, to other villages throughout France who didn't have a parish priest to perform a mass for whatever function.
But this was common practice amongst priests of the day. They all did that. And if he was a bent priest, why did he write it all down and leave the evidence behind for everyone to find and say, that's where he got the money, he stole it by performing masses that he couldn't possibly have performed and being paid for them? Why leave the evidence behind? When he died, he had a stroke on the 17th of January and he died on the 22nd. He had 5 days to clean house. And also he was old. He knew he was coming to the end of his thing. So why leave it behind for us to find and accuse him of being a criminal?
So when I'm being a cynic on this whole story, I'm thinking that he sold masses. That's where the money came from. He died in poverty. He didn't have any money.
No, he didn't. He didn't, because he just commissioned 6 million francs worth of work to be carried out in the village about 2 or 3 weeks before his attack and death. So he'd actually signed a contract for new work to begin in the village for that much money. So he wasn't poor when he was broke. He had a lean time during the First World War when he couldn't seemingly, go on his travels to collect his funds from wherever it was he was collecting it. But he, by no means is it established that he was broke when he died.
Well, it's interesting because people come to his aid when he first comes to the village and becomes the parish priest.
Poached and begged.
The Countess of Chambord.
He spent 6 years in poverty before the Countess de Chambord gave him the money to do.
So this is the wife of the pretender to the throne of France gives money to this priest, but also prior to that gave the same amount of money to another priest who proceeds to develop his estate. In this case, it's Louis de Coma and Carroll, so not a million miles away.
The word gigolo is thrown in Saunière's direction quite often as well. He was a.
Well, I was going to ask, why would this person give money to Bérenger Saunière?
Well, there's a big political, obviously, movement going on, and it's very pro-monarchy sort of. Well, that's just it. And what does he do with the money? Well, he begins to renovate the church. And when I'm not being a skeptic, then I'm looking at some interesting things that he did. We can talk about the Stations of the Cross, and I believe you had Ben Hammott on the show, and he probably told you all about the Stations of the Cross.
We'll go there in a while.
But one of the things that's interesting is he builds, like, just for instance, the Tower of the Magdalene, the Tor Magdala.
Yeah.
And he seems, you could read a lot of things into this, but it seems as though he's encoded the number 22, the feast day of Mary Magdalene, various places. Now, it could just be coincidental, right? So you have this tower, the Tower of the Magdalene, and it has these tiles inside, and all the tiles are the same, except one's got a little red dot that points up 22 steps to one window at an offset of 22 degrees, literally, and I've measured it, points out a mile in the distance to a grotto whose ancient place name is the burial site of Mary Magdalene. Oh. And it's this grotto, or the one kind of next to it, where some recent discoveries have been made. And
there's the Ben Hammott discovery.
Yes. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's some interesting things going on in the village.
But that's not the real interesting stuff. You know, the thing is you've got to forget all of the kind of interpretation of what's in the church, because nobody knows if anything was left there. Nobody knows if anything points to a cave. Nobody knows for sure what it is. This is all supposition.
You look through the window. It's unambiguous. It points exactly out to the cave.
So what? You can look out of the window here and see something magical and wonderful.
Well, I agree coincidence is coincidence, but when you have a window this big pointing exactly at a monument in the landscape, it brings my attention to it.
It's still only a theory. And, you know...
So what about this? I mean, you know, the Holy Grail always gets worked into this, doesn't it? About Scabies and the Holy Grail.
Well, it's because it's Cathar country. It's where the Templars were.
And you had Otto Rahn there.
The Troubadours were. Otto Rahn was down the road. You know, this is prime candidate country for all four of those claiming to have.
So people think Bérenger Saunière may have discovered the Holy Grail,
or a secret from one of those groups,
whatever
be it
the Holy Grail
religious,
is.
be whatever the Grail may or may not be. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that when Rome sacked Jerusalem, you know, they marched the menorah, and there's a plaque of that, and you kind of know what booty they took, right? So when the Visigoths sack Rome in 410, where do they go?
Yeah,
they go to the Pyrenees.
Yeah, but hang on. Titus spent all of the money when he sacked Jerusalem on building the Colosseum.
But do you think he burnt down the gold? Do you think he burnt down the relics?
It's a well-historical established fact that that's what Titus did. Was he built the Colosseum with the money and the wealth that he got from Jerusalem. Look at the Colosseum. Imagine what it would have cost to build. What the Visigoths took, they took. But the thing of it being a massive amount of you know, Jerusalem treasure is not necessarily accurate, true, or even available.
Well, there's historians who actually inventory what was in the booty that the Visigoths brought to the Pyrenees. So, point taken. But it's interesting that some of the most prized relics from antiquity, arguably, could be traceable to this region. And Otto Rahn, who is the consummate Grail researcher, you know, he camped out there. He lived in the area for a couple of years and left, leaving the impression that he was successful.
So very briefly, very quickly, we have a list. We have maybe the temple treasure. We have maybe the Holy Grail, whatever that is, whether it's the concept of a bloodline, whether it's a stone, a plate, a platter, a cup, or a number of other things, you know, philosopher's stone, whatever. What else have we got that could possibly be this treasure?
Well, you have
that's hidden?
One of the strongest connections for me is the Troubadours, because they were the very first source of the Grail legend given to Chrétien de Troyes, and the Troubadours lived in that region, the Languedoc. That was where they were, and for me, that is an interesting aspect of the story, because if you trace anything back to its source, then you're getting close to, you know.
Have you spent time looking at the Troubadour? You know, what they were singing about, what their whole thing was about. Have you looked into that? Because isn't that a treasure in itself?
Well, yeah, but the thing with it was a lot of it isn't written down. A lot of it was sung.
No, there's oral traditions, and a lot of it's written down now, isn't it?
And, well, yeah.
It is, because I've been looking at it recently.
Well, yeah, I've got stuff that is as well, you know, whether we know that's what it is.
I'm working on a Robin Hood thing, so I'm been honed in on troubadours recently, you know, because especially at that period, you've got the Robin tales coming from the troubadours in many respects. So I've been looking at the original, you know, the oldest French text that there are, and some of that stuff is so Gnostic.
Extremely.
That's treasure to me, from being a person who likes that kind of stuff. That's treasure.
Well, this is the other Grail, is your spiritual satisfaction, being able to live with yourself and feel good. And, hey man, let's roll another one.
And when the Cathars started to get sort of, you know, closed down, right? the Troubadours, they saw the writing on the wall, and so they fled north, a lot of them to Germany, and you know, so these oral traditions now go to Germany, and all of a sudden you have Wolf von Eschenbach writing Parsifal, and so the tradition seems to start to be getting written down in part, even though its origins are probably not French. It probably goes back a lot further.
So have we covered everything that could possibly be the treasure, or is there?
Well, there's another. There's several actually. You go.
Well, apart from that, you know, there's gold in them hills anyway. The
Yeah.
Romans mined it. They were gold mines in that area.
Right.
So
he could have just basically stumbled across
He
an
could-
old Roman hoard.
and you know, there's constant reports of bits of gold turning up on pathways and in woods, and
Right.
you know, and as Andy says, you know, when the Visigoths went down there, which they did, you know, I'm not disputing that. I'm just disputing what they actually had with them. And how
I mean,
much
for people
of it
at home,
was.
Visigoths were kind of the people that came up from Gotland.
They were
Norway.
Roman mercenaries.
Yeah, and they were used by the Romans.
Really, well, that's how they managed to beat the Romans in Jerusalem, was because they knew that Titus was a pushover.
I don't think, guys. One of the things that has always intrigued me, fascinated me, and made me fall asleep laughing with hysterics is the Priory of Sion. Who wants to go first on that? You know, I mean, obviously, of course, you don't want to say too much. You don't want to get yourself into trouble next time you're in Paris and get yourself killed by this.
Well, the Priory
Whatever they are.
The Priory of Sion, I initially took the opinion that anything with Priory of Sion written on it, or the PS logo on it, was not to be taken seriously and was a hoax or a fraud, and was deliberately placed in there for other reasons, which have never really come clear, but I've got my own theories, that it was just really to establish a credibility in order to try and, you know, go digging in the village.
Right. Okay.
But the funny thing is that when you talk to anybody that researches it, like Clive Prince, Guy Patton, or anybody that's actually looked at the Priory of Sion, will tell you that it's really inconclusive, and that there are a lot of tenuous links and connections that are around people that are supposedly involved, and that really, you know, the jury seems to stay out. But I still stick with my original, that it's
You've never
all
seen
a
a
load
bit of document that's been carbon dated to, say, 16th century with Da Vinci's name on it, saying, I'm a member of the Priory of Sion.
No, there's no historical traces in the Priory of Sion. There's no records. There's no, apart from the ones that Pierre Plantard seems to have inserted himself.
Yeah.
Which was what, in the 50s, wasn't it? I think.
So we're back to a creation of an egotistical kind of
Well, a treasure hunter.
treasure hunter.
I think, you know, the story is with Bérenger Saunière. He discovered supposedly that there are different versions of the story of Saunière, but they all involved in finding a document of some kind. Two Man's document is different to the one that is Plantard's documents. Now, the documents that were made famous by Henry Lincoln in Holy Blood and Holy Grail, there's two of them. One's a small one that's very easy to decode. The other one's a large one that's virtually impossible to decode. And I think that there's records that Pierre Plantard, the supposed head of the Priory of Sion, his father was in Rennes-le-Château while Marie de Narno was still alive, and I suspect that the large document could very well be genuine, and Plantard discovered this document through his father and then could do nothing with it. And I think that that's why Plantard's partner de Cherici concocted the smaller document in order to try and draw people in. Even Henry Lincoln says that when he discovered the code in the first parchment, when he asked Pierre Plantard why didn't they put a decoding of it in the book, his answer was, because we thought it would interest someone like you. Now that to me says that this is an invitation.
Here we go.
And if you're into this kind of thing, then maybe you wouldn't mind having a look at this difficult one.
Right.
But I don't hold much truck with it in modern research, because there's only ever been one decoding of those parchments, and that was always provided by Plantard. Nobody else has done it. But everybody, even the people that rubbish Henry Lincoln, the Paul Smiths, and that try and discredit the whole thing, still use that decoding of that document as their evidence against the case, even though it's come from an unstable source.
And one of the weird things about it is those documents and others like it, lineages, list of grand masters of the Priory of Sion that just, very coincidentally pick out all the sort of prolific people of their era. They're filed, they're put in a file in the French National Library over a couple of decades. And it's just such a long-term, if I can use the word, scam. It's not like, let's try to create this aura of a Priory of Sion, and we'll do it for a couple of years, and then if people buy it, great. Otherwise, we'll just give up.
It reads like a list of wishful thinking.
Long-term investment in creating this mythology.
Yeah.
And that's what gives you, pause.
So that's what starts to make you think of conspiracy theories as to what is Plantard and the Cherassy up to, etc., etc.
Well,
is there a bigger picture?
I always look for the ending of the story. When if you set out to commit a hoax or a fraud, then obviously there's an ambition and a goal to be achieved. And with Plantard and the Cherassy, it seems virtually impossible to find one that they actually achieved. There was nothing that was done apart from they seemed to get themselves into...
Well, they're infamous.
But they never really came out with books. They never really came out with, they never hit the...
So what's your intuitive feeling? What do you think they were up to?
I think they were genuinely trying to solve the mystery of Saunier's wealth and find where it came from, and I think they wanted it.
But you also think that they created the Priory of Sion?
I think they tried to give themselves credibility by pretending to be the lost crowned heads of France.
Well, that's the important bit, I think. I think that is, I personally think that is the motivation of a lot of these figures, the public ones like Plantard, but also some private ones that we probably don't have visibility to.
And remember, that was a royal church at Rennes. So if you turned up in a tiny village in the middle of nowhere and started digging in the graveyard, and somebody says, what are you doing? Yeah. And you turn around and pull out a piece of paper that says, actually, you know what, I should be the King of France. Yeah. And these are my relatives, and you don't mind, but we're just going to nip down into the crypt and take some of this gold away.
That is one of the things that kind of the French mayor would, in a particular certain place, would appreciate, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But it goes along with the ego, etc., which is a very French thing, isn't it, that we both know about.
And the place was a white elephant.
Maybe that's true.
As well, don't forget there wasn't much. It's a third of the whole village. So, but it's empty. It's gardens. It's there's like a guest house and the church. There's
lots of holes everywhere now as well.
There always was. I mean, for me, when we were talking about Saunier and the mystery earlier, for me, one of the things I really love about the mystery are the tunnels and the fact that there are secret passages there that built into the house that Saunier had built into the place. The fireplace really does swing open to reveal a chamber.
There's many houses there. They're just going to implode into the ground like any week now.
And it does happen. I mean, Jean-Luc Robin was telling me, because every time I'd find a tunnel, and I did find a couple, I'd tell Jean-Luc, because they all know, the people that live in the village know where the stuff is, they know where the tunnels are. And he told me they'd have, incidences where the whole ground would just suddenly cave in, and they'd have a funeral going on, and suddenly there'd just be a huge hole in the ground where, because somebody was like digging underneath it and hadn't shored it up.
And out pops Ben Hammott with a video.
And out pops Tim then with a
cheap shot. Sorry, Ben. The lineage thing to me is really interesting, and so there's very few things you could wrestle to the ground with this whole Rennes story that are based on fact and documented.
That is one of those things that's come out of it, though, isn't it? Bloodline.
Yeah, but and just to pick up on that thought, one of the pieces of mythology which I think is fascinating is the Hapsburg connection. So you're talking 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century. Rat and I go round and round on this one. There's a gentleman, Johann Salvator, who's a Hapsburg, who's sent by, now the Habsburgs, of course, are the rulers of the known world. They decide basically who the next pope is going to be. They have more power than any family has had for the past several hundred years, right? But their dynasty is in decline, really in decline. It's in its waning years. So the ruler of the Habsburg sends his archduke to Rennes-le-Château, and he's called a stranger by the locals, and he's meeting with the priest, Bérenger Saunière. So what is he doing there? What's going on? Yeah. People would argue that actually the Habsburgs told the priest where he could reclaim and find something, or the priest found something that the Habsburgs could in fact use to continue to strengthen their dynasty, which was fading. And re-establish their control over the church. So what could give them the power over the church that they would have wanted? Now, hold that thought, because Franz Joseph passes control of his family, of his rule, to Franz Ferdinand. So if he's gotten some information, just say for sake of a story, he's got some information from a lineage or some scrolls that he found in Rennes-le-Château, he passes it to Franz Ferdinand. What happens to Franz Ferdinand? He's assassinated in Sarajevo in an event that most people believed was the start of the First World War.
Yeah.
So who would the knowledge, if there was knowledge to be had, who would it have been passed to then? It would have gone to Karl, who's now the emperor.
Right.
Karl is put on the ladder to sainthood. So one person is assassinated, one person is put on the ladder to sainthood. Could they have been after some information they knew was there, or had found out the priest had discovered, that could give them this control over the church they had had for all those centuries?
10 years ago, I was interested in this stuff, and I decided it was bull. So I left it all alone, right? Recently, there was the Ben Hammott thing, which we had on my show. And there's other things going off as well that are being researched in the background, which we can discuss. But this Hapsburg thing is very, very strange, because why would such powerful families have anything to do with a small village priest? What is going off there? Right? Have you got an insight into the...
Well, I think it's much simpler than that. I think that was it was a royal church. I think that Visigothic treasure, jewellery, is quite likely to have been in the area, if not underneath that church. And I think Saunière sold it back to the Habsburgs.
That's a different insight.
Well, and that's an interesting theory, and I like it, because we didn't really touch upon this, but when Saunière discovers whatever he discovers, he allegedly makes a trip to Paris. His boss, the bishop, says, go to Paris, they can help you decipher this stuff there, because that's really complicated. So he goes to Paris. But part of the mythology that's come out in Michael Basion's book, The Jesus Papers, is that a priest in Oxford got dispatched to help a much younger priest in Paris decipher whatever Saunière found.
Right.
And this priest, Canon Lilly, goes back to Oxford and tells his colleagues that he now no longer has any faith in anything that's written in the Bible, cannot believe it, and in fact, he now is confident that a substitution was made at the time of the crucifixion. Christ was not crucified, somebody else was, and in fact, he lived to 45 AD. So if something like that was true, what a wonderful nugget for the Habsburgs to say, hey, Vatican, guess what I know?
Yeah, but the trouble is it's all unfounded, isn't it? There's absolutely no evidence for any of it.
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, how can you wrestle us to the ground?
Well,
Rat and I discussed this at pubs, and we're like,
I know.
ready to...
I mean, what are we looking for? What are we going to... Is there some real work going off to actually find any real hard evidence?
No.
Or is it
No,
just
that's
still
not the
people
point.
that are just playing?
That's not why I do it. I'm fascinated by the subject. It's a treasure hunt. There's tunnels to look in. There's secret
Are there
places.
no academics looking at this at all?
Yeah, of course there are. I guess. I mean, but they've had since 1972 all the smart asses, haven't they? Really, and I think that for my part, I'm much more interested in looking at the reality of Bérenger Saunière did exist. So did Marie Donano. These are the buildings he put up. Yeah. These are undeniable. They were real people that really lived there, and there's still people alive in the village today.
I think
that
the
very close
Visigothic
connection.
The Visigothic thing is very, very interesting, because we know for a fact that Visigoths were there. They were well known for
but don't forget,
stealing treasure.
Yeah, but that was the main route between France and Spain.
Yeah.
That route through the Pyrenees. Yeah. They all went through there.
Yeah.
Just the Visigoths isn't enough, really. It's just that they tie in nicely with having religious treasure.
Yeah, and it kind of goes along with the kind of tomb things as well, doesn't it? So there are Visigoth burials in there, aren't there?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure where, though. Where? What
we'll have to talk
then?
about this after, because more information came to light recently, which we'll talk about at another time, which is very, very interesting and highlights possible Visigoth burials, possibly between two very important people in the Visigoth world. Maria of the Alkazites and Ataulf, two people that are very interesting. So, there may be some interesting stuff here yet to come out, but I'll let you have the information. Yeah. Because there's nobody better to go into this. I can definitely say that. I mean, I want to know where it's going to go from here. There's no definites in any of this, is there?
No, but there's no facts you can really wrestle to the ground, but there's some really interesting, again, pieces of mythology. One of the researchers that Rat and I both respect a lot, Jean-Luc Raban, passed away just a couple of years ago, and it's one of those pieces of mythology at Rennes-le-Château after spending years trying to displace the current mayor from the village. And the day that his team won the election, he was found dead in his bed. So things like that, sadly, he's a good friend of ours, so happen all too often in this story. But he had just attended, prior to that, a few months before, the funeral of the oldest chap in the village. And at the funeral, he was talking to a gentleman who is now the oldest person in the village, who actually attended Sunday school by Maria. Saunier's is called the priest Madonna. Yeah. And there's this great story that he told Jean-Luc that at the end of Sunday school, Maria would oftentimes close the book, the Bible, and say, "Children, if I could only tell you the real story."
Obviously, if I lived in Rennes-le-Château, a small village, which we've all been to and picked litter up, I would be, firstly, annoyed that there's so many people coming. Like Roslyn, for instance. I went to Roslyn years and years and years ago. Beautiful little place. You could pull the moss off of things, and now it's Disneyland. Rennes-le-Château. What, you go there a lot. What do the people think? How is it affecting them?
I think the majority of the villagers enjoy the tourism and like the money coming in and the small amount of work and wealth that it does generate for them. I think that really, though, they are bemused by most of it because they live there and they've heard every story. They know every cave, they know every tunnel, they know the whole thing, and they get quite mischievous with it. I remember one of them when we were there. We were in the bar and this fat Belgian turned up with a walking cane, saying he just discovered this cave. And he was convinced he decoded everything. And these people get really intense and hyper about. And he was really excited. And they said, "Well, where is it?" And he said, "Oh, it's up by the Devil's Armchair." And he said, "But it's full of water." And I said, "Well, I've just been up to the Devil's Armchair that day." And I said, "Well, there's no road to it. How to get a pump up there? It's, Yeah. How are you going to do that?" And he said, "No, I'll have to do it all by hand. It'll probably take me 2 days, but I've cracked it." And anyway, when he left, the guy sitting next to me said, "Oh, we know all about this cave. We've known it for years. We just let him go off and spend 2 days hard physical labour draining it out to find nothing." And so they have their own way of dealing with it. And the other one is Jean-Luc Robin, where some guy's digging away there quite merrily, on somebody's private land. So they go to the dump, they find an old glass bottle, they write a note in it, they put it in a bottle, and then they bury it just underneath where the guy's been digging. He finds the bottle the next day and it says continue, and so and meanwhile they're sitting there sipping pasties going, look at that.
Now that brings us very nicely onto another subject with bottles and with parchments in them. Recently I had somebody that we all know, the tomb man, Ben Hammott, not his real name of course, on the show. Now, as I said before, I left this Rennes-le-Château stuff 10 years ago. So when he came on the show, I was completely fresh to it again. I had no idea what would be going off in the last 10 years. Ben, of course, is all over the internet. I had no idea because it doesn't interest me. Ben sits there and pulls out the Holy Grail and parchments in bottles and this incredible Indiana Jones tale, which just blew us all away because we've got carbon dating being thrown at us, DNA testing, experts from DRAC, etc., all being paraded out as evidence for the Ben Hammott thing. Now, after now weeks of since that show, still don't know what the truth is. You guys got any opinions or any ideas on whether it's true or not?
I really like Ben. He's a great guy.
He's a great guy.
He's a great guy to hang out with, drink, take laughs, and maybe even go on the odd midnight grave robbing trip with. He's and he is. He's very much the real deal.
He's joking?
No.
He does. He goes to places where, like Henry Lincoln and the Saunière Society are very, very respectful of the area, and it's very much look and don't touch and do the thing. Whereas you got Ben on the other hand, who's kind of no, actually, I want to get in there and see what's really going.
Dynamite in one hand, doesn't he?
Pick and shovel. Usually,
I was sat here and he's going, "This is a 14th century parchment," and we're going, "Stop touching it, then." What are you doing?
Yeah. There's a lot of much as I love Ben dearly, there's a lot of holes in his story.
Yeah.
And I think, just from things like the very early photographs he showed to the later photographs of the cave where the body is, things had moved. It was slightly different. It's, I don't know if anybody's really researched his, the carbon dating and the people that supposedly have authenticated things. And just because those coins are genuine, you can get them on eBay, as you can a lot of other stuff.
Century cup that was the Holy Grail.
And there's quite a few things that make me sceptical about it, and the rest of it. But at the same token, I'd hate to be wrong.
No, but his methodology is actually, if he's found that, if it is a tomb and it does have a body and it did have the Holy Grail, and his methodology, although it's discovered it, has actually also killed him. It stopped it from being accepted. Because if it had been done properly with archaeology and all the proper processes of the IFA had been taken into account.
Well, Ben will tell you that he tried to do that, but once he discovered the cave and once he made the discovery, he's now he wanted to verify what was in there before he went public and went to track, etc., etc. Yeah. And he thinks brilliantly on his feet. It's either if he's making it up, he's really, really good at it.
He is,
or he's being fed. And
I think, like you, I think he's a really good guy, and I was very critical early on.
You didn't say that in the car.
Very funny. Not true, Ben. And I think we have to give him time. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of tombs in this area, There's a lot of tombs, and if he has one, and it appears he does, it won't be the first. So I don't have a problem with the tomb. And I await some official feedback and insight from the French authorities, namely DRAC. What I'm less comfortable with, and it doesn't mean I'm right, I'm just less comfortable with, are the bottles in the chest.
Yeah. Well, the parchments alone, I mean, for something that's supposedly an ancient document, it spells Templar in English. And this is supposedly Saunière, supposedly the author. How come there are English words in this parchment that you have discovered that is pointing you on the way? And the other thing that makes me kind of suspicious is the fact he's found all these bottles and it's led him nowhere. He found the cave before he found the clues. And that, to me,
sound
is
very ideal for TV, though, don't they?
What do you mean?
There's a movie, Bloodline, which was made around this. So the whole clue process to get into this thing is a nice Indiana Jones edition, isn't it?
Well, kind of. But a lot of this stuff has changed as well. What you see in the film as Ben discovering isn't what he originally put down as having discovered. There's different markings on the stone. I found a stone there, but it's a different stone to the one that he says he found. And there's kind of quite a few inconsistencies with it. And
I think we give him time to produce results formally, officially on the tomb. And in terms of the bottles in the chest, although I'm suspicious of them, I don't think he would be the culprit. So I find, once again, that the misdirection in the story is more interesting than any perhaps real historical
But that's
elements.
what Bloodlines says, isn't it? This is the Priory of Sion feeding us clues and information to find the great secret.
Yeah, I mean, he's quite right. At the end of the day, this is a fascinating human story of so many angles. It's just a real web, isn't it?
You don't even need to believe in flying saucers to enjoy it.
And on that score, flying saucers.
Oh yeah.
Let's change subject completely, because Rennes-le-Château now, I think we've kind of done it and been there, haven't we? I don't think there's anything else to go. On the paranormal, etc. You guys, you get dragged into all kinds of different things. Much like I do. Even though, we may not sit there and state our beliefs in UFOs and paranormals and ghosts or whatever fairies in the back garden, you get dragged into it because you're seen as being a researcher into the unusual. What's your opinions on paranormal, ghosts, aliens, that kind of thing?
That's a loaded question,
isn't it?
There's a
Didn't
lot
see
of
that one
answer
coming.
in that one, yeah. I think
I've got to fill time, and I want to sit back and do nothing.
I think you're talking about belief, and somebody that believes in ghosts and alien beings from another planet they've decided, they've made up their mind. And just because I don't believe it doesn't mean that it's not true. Like UFOs, it only takes one to be real. And, that's that whole thing done. But I think what we have is a very interesting human need to believe. And I think what we're missing is the church, whereas I think the population's beliefs used to be in Christ and on a Sunday morning, and the vicar being very much part of our social group. That's declined, enormously. And I think other people now look to other places for something to believe in.
Yeah.
And I think, sadly, a lot of religion is so flawed, and the Bible and the stories and questionable, that people it just now has become something that, well, that's the story that they tell, but it's not really relevant to me. I'd rather believe in fairies. I'd rather believe in flying sources. I mean, really, to be honest with you, the story of Christ is pretty much UFO anyway, isn't it? It's kind of a sentient being from the heavens, comes down, mixes with a load of good people, then dies, and then is resurrected. And in fact, I'll tell you something, so is E.T. It's the same story. It's the same,
It's an archetype. It's Osiris. It just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. But, I think we absolutely underestimate what goes on in the human psyche, in the brain. And I think all these things, as exciting, as romantic as they are, and you can't rule it out, right? Because you can't wrestle it to the ground. But I really think it's in people's heads. And that's not to say that what's in your head, in your consciousness, isn't a whole nother real world that you can tap into. But I tend to think it's not so much an external physical thing as it is an internal subconscious thing.
And it's been around for an awful long time, hasn't it? I mean, man has been having experience since...
Well, there's medieval wood carvings of strange discs in the sky.
Oh, we can go back for...
It's something that's always around, and there's always a belief in the unknown, and I think that it's kind of anybody that's hiked over a moor or taken a very long walk through a muddy field kind of realises how suddenly exposed to the elements in the real world you are, and the thought of actually there being good creatures there that kind of frighten you away or attract you or guide your ship in late at night. They're kind of... It's a faith that we have to... I think we have to have it in some ways. I don't believe in God, or anything really, but I have witnessed the coincidence thing that happens, when you get onto the Rennes-le-Château story. When I first started doing the book with Push, I said to him, and I was able to predict that coincidences would start happening. The more involved he got in the subject, the stronger they would become. And he was a journalist and really just wanted to write the book. It wasn't. But by the end of our time there, he was hearing voices and seeing things, and the whole thing had become. But the whole thing had become a reality. Now, I'm not saying I'm a seer. You can say it to anybody that gets onto the Rennes-le-Château subject, starts investigating it with any kind of earnest endeavour. A string of coincidences will follow.
Yeah.
And it does. And now to be able to predict
Yeah. Well, they're kind of opening their perceptions up, aren't they, to something new. And
or is it just red mini syndrome? That's so. There's the question: which part of our mind is working here?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what is it?
Are we pushing something out and it's coming back to us, or are we just opening our perceptions up to something and seeing it?
For sure.
But these whole topics, though, the funny thing is that they were not lost. Going back to Rennes-le-Château just for a moment, they weren't lost on those priests. I mean, priests in that era, they were involved, or so it would appear, in all kinds of esoteric pursuits. Paranormal, normal, supernatural. They were Martinists, they were Masonic. They were into all these different sort of societies. And in fact, one of the ones which is sort of current and emerging with some pretty strong researchers behind it is that, yes, Saunière was selling masses, and that's how he got a lot of his wealth. They weren't like masses for normal occasions. The school of thought says it was part of a ritual that took care of your soul and made sure that even if you had a really bad life, no problem. We can get you through purgatory into heaven. And if you had a really
Can I
good
just
life...
point out, though, about Saunière, when you talk about him doing rituals, anything's ritualistic in the church anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sacrament
Absolutely.
It's a form of ritual. But people forget he was a Catholic priest. He'd spent 18 years being educated solely by the Catholic religion. He was a priest. He was a very good priest. And he was a religious man and an honest man from my researches. Now, when we were doing the book, the only evidence that there is of Saunière that remains is handwriting. So we went to see a handwriting expert to find out what they would say about this person. And it was very, very revealing. When you show somebody the accounts book of supposedly these illegal masses that he accepted, and you say to a handwriting expert, was he honest? And she says, yes, he was.
Right.
Then I start to believe that. And I also, like I say, he was a Catholic priest. You can't shunt that to one side. That his belief was very...
You can't just say that he was a straight and narrow Catholic, because there's enough evidence, emblems on some of his papers, to indicate that he was involved in other societies as well, as were any number of priests at that time.
Well, it was very fashionable
very
at that point in
fashionable.
time.
Absolutely
you couldn't
was.
move in Paris without tripping over a wizard,
And the thing that people forget when they talk about this mystery is it's not just the one priest. There's several of them. His good mate who he meets with after he discovers his tomb and writes in his diary that he has done so is brutally assassinated a few years later. Yeah. Absolutely brutalized. And the other ones died deaths that some people would say were mysterious. Abbe Boudet, his mentor perhaps in the next village, his body decomposed rapidly as if poisoned. Again, is it part of the mythology, or did these priests glom onto something that people said, no, you know too much?
Or are we just writing mysteries in where there aren't any?
Yeah.
No,
well, we've got 30 seconds left. It's absolutely fascinating. And yet again, we could go on for 8-9 hours just talking about Rennes-le-Château and the incredible, intricate web of intrigue that there is surrounding it. But I want to thank both my guests, Andrew Gough and Scabies, for coming on the show tonight. And again, if anybody wants to know more, you can go to andrewgough.com and you can see a bit more about it and see some pictures and stories and all that sort of stuff. So join me again.
Can I break things now?
Get on with it. On today's programme, we've got a really special guest. His name's Philip Coppens, and he's a good friend and a very erudite author who's written numerous books, which I would highly recommend. But today we're going to be talking about one of his new books. His new book is called Servants of the Grail. Fascinating book, which goes off in tangents that one wouldn't realise with the Grail. Philip, thank you very much for joining me again on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Servants of the Grail. Now, the first thing that springs to mind for a lot of people that are watching this is, well, what's the Grail? The Grail is something that we are told caught the blood of Jesus on the cross or was used at the Last Supper. So this kind of assumes that there is a man called Jesus, or was a man called Jesus in the past. So this is one of the first obstacles that a lot of people will have to overcome, especially on this channel and in this genre. There's a lot of talk about, did he even exist in the first place? So how do you overcome that with this book?
Well, it happened at the time of the Da Vinci Code, which has just reinforced that belief and has steered away the entire conversation into Mary Magdalene and even more obscure stuff to do with Christianity. But when you actually strip the Grail to its bare bones, you come up with something completely different. For example, the first person to write about it, Hugh de Payens, he doesn't define the Grail. He just talks about this object, which he has great admiration for and writes this book about. Now, he doesn't define it. He doesn't say what the Grail is. But in the next few years, some people begin to do that. And what they do is they jump in and say, this is a Christian relic. This is something to do with Joseph of Arimathea. This is something this is something that, the cup of Christ, all of these things. But then, from Germany, Wolfram von Aschenbach stands up and says, no, they are all wrong. They are all wrong, and I'm going to put it all right. And he writes a book called Parsifal. And when you look at the history of people writing about the Grail, and specifically historians try to categorize everything, because that's what they like doing, they are able to identify, obviously, Hugh de Payens as the first, and then various people who've copied him and have made this into Christian relic. As to Wolfram, he's a veritable enigma, because they don't know what to do with him. And he's the most interesting guy. For example, everybody claims that he wrote fiction. Well, he claims, I'm writing the truth. So you've got an interesting paradox there. He's saying he's going to write a family history. He is known to have written nothing but family histories. So to make him write a fiction, which is what everybody tries to pretend, needs some kind of careful molding, to put it lightly.
Yeah.
But it really is very difficult to kind of like pinpoint him. And that was the reason why I started writing the book, because I wanted to find out what Wolfram was up to.
Right. You call it Servants of the Grail. So who are these servants? This is all part of the Parsifal story.
Yes. When you start looking into Wolfram, the very first thing he puts in his book is 600 proper names of people. That's not good script writing. Every editor will tell you, you've got to kind of like not do that. So already there's a hint that there's something else going on, that it might be a real family history. Now, a German PhD student called André de Mandak actually did a PhD study on Wolfram, and what he came up with was very interesting. He said, what if all of the names which are in this book are actually nicknames? So, Parsifal, what if that's the nickname of a real person? King and Fortress, what if that's the real name of a person? This approach had been done before, but what he did was very unique in the sense that he cracked the code. And anybody can do this at home. Just go on Google, and Fortis, give it a Latin ending, which makes it Fortius. And it's the known nickname of King Alfonso I of Aragon.
Right.
That's the first bit. Parsifal, composed of two things, Pars and Val. Switch them around, and you have got Val de Pars or Val de Perche. Is a known valley. In the Grail legends, you've got, I'll just name three because they're like the most telling examples. We know that King Anfortas is the uncle to Parsifal. Well, there is a person, a ruler from the Parsifal line, if you want, from Val de Perche, which is near Paris. Rotrud II, he was called. He is the nephew of King Anfortas or Alfonso I.
Right.
In the Grail legend, you have got Anfortas, who has got a brother, and he's known as the Hermit, and he's a monk. Guess what? King Alfonso I has got a very notorious brother, whose nickname was actually the Monk as well.
Right.
Because he at one point was a bishop. So all of these things start slotting into place perfectly within the proper time frame. And then the killer one, in Parsifal, King Anfortas, his grandfather, is the one who has built the Grail Castle. The real guy, Alfonso I of Aragon, his grandfather, has built a castle called San Juan de la Peña, which is reputed to be the Grail Castle, and had a cup at one point, which actually the church claims is the closest pretendant to the Grail.
Is this the picture on the front of the book?
That's just an imaginary cup.
That's an imaginary cup, okay.
But the real cup now sits in Valencia. And
this is the famous Valencia cup.
exactly.
Right.
And that's the one which they tried to have John Pope Pope John Paul II use for a mass in Valencia. He refused at the very last moment, but the current Pope, Pope Benedict, he's actually gone to Valencia and used it in mass.
Some people say that that itself is a copy anyway, don't they?
Yes. Now, there's a twist to this story, but I'll come back to that later. But
okay.
The cup as such is only known to have existed from 1399 onwards. And what they are trying to do is link this to early Christianity. Now, they have to cover 1,400 years. And the way they're doing this is they keep referring to the presence of a cup in San Juan de la Peña around the 11th century. And of course, any monastery will have cups, will have precious cups.
Yeah.
They have never been able to link that. But at this moment in time, for either whatever reason the Vatican will have, they're kind of they're not really too much bothered about this 200-year gap, and they are willing to endorse this cup. It's an interesting question, which I don't go into the book, but if you're a conspiracy theorist, you might want to go there.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, and I know you're probably going to hate me for doing so, but you talk about these correlations, you know, that a brother was a monk, that a king built a castle. Kings build castles, and lots of royals had brothers that were monks because that was the done thing. So are there lots and lots of these correlations, these synchronicities or coincidences that build up the story? Or there are others?
Yeah, there are several synchronicities, but the actual one is the most telling one. There's this. Wolfram calls his characters Anfortas, Alfonso's nickname, everybody called him in 40 years. So that's a one-on-one comparison.
Yeah.
Rothschild II, Val de Percival is another one. So it all fits together with the time frame, the known origins, the known locations.
Right.
And there are also very interesting aspects whereby history and Wolfram's story kind of like provide an answer. For example, history tells us that Alfonso I of Aragon was unable to reproduce for some unknown reason. No historical documentation. The Grail account kind of says, well, King and Fortus couldn't reproduce.
Yes.
So it's like extremely detailed.
Yeah.
The closest comparison would be you having a twin brother who has gone exactly the same life as you have, and somehow a writer would have mistaken you for your twin brother. But what are the chances? And it's really up to those who want to destroy this PhD thesis from André de Mandac to point out where it really doesn't fit or where it isn't compatible. He came up with this in 1986, so it's withstood the test of time.
Right.
It's just not that well known because he's written it in German and he's never had it properly published.
Who cares about that? So it's got to be in English if it's going to be accepted.
Hence the book.
Absolutely. So the story of Percival, does this make, is there some meaning to it then that was placed in there? Is there some real history in there?
Yeah. The story of Percival is very much just that of a wandering knight who goes off somewhere, comes across this castle, doesn't really understand what's going on, wakes up probably after a drunken night out or something, the same feeling we would have, and realizes everything is gone, nobody's there anymore, what's happened. Continues his journeys, comes back 6 years later, and all of a sudden is confronted with the same situation. And now he's got to maturity, the level, and he kind of like knows what to do. And he asks the proper question. So it's also a moral story, which is obviously what every good story is, whether it's novel or not.
This is the one that's trumpeted out mostly when you watch a documentary on television. You get all these scholars sat there going, that's the Grail story, it's all about, you know, and that's what we've known for a long, long time now. And coming in at a complete tangent to this then.
Exactly. But it is Wolfram who has really worked with that story, and there are two other American scholars, Kahane and Kahane, as you can probably guess, are brothers, and they have been identifying that some of the sections which Wolfram put in there were taken from the Corpus Hermeticum. Now, the interesting thing is that at that moment in time, the Corpus Hermeticum was officially not yet known in Europe. However...
Well, stop there. What's the Corpus Hermeticum for everybody out there who doesn't know what it is?
The Corpus Hermeticum is 14 treatises to do with what was believed to be Egyptian knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's what founded the Renaissance movement. When it was published in Latin, it created the Renaissance. People went berserk over it. Now, again, it's supposed to be only have come about in Europe in the Renaissance, but it's known that it was present in Spain as long as the 8th century, if not before. It's Alfonso I of Aragon who did the Reconquista in Spain. Yeah. And so we know that lots of information from Spain...
meaning that the Muslims were there and
they were taken away from
went in and took certain lands back.
Yeah. And he took knowledge from that, and he's also known to have been instrumental for creating the school of Chartres, the giant, enormous cathedral just outside of Paris. So lots of this information has been coming about, has been seeping through, and we know that certain sections from Wolfram's story were literally taken from the Corpus Hermeticum, as Kahane and Kahane have been underlying.
Right. Okay. So the Corpus Hermeticum is believed to be Egyptian wisdom. We don't really know entirely where it came from, do we, originally? But it's certainly something that a great many mystery traditions and mystery schools have been looking at for a long time.
And still are.
And still are. I mean, I know several Freemasons, for instance, who read it alongside, their own literature. So what's so important about it?
It's important because at the time it went so against Christianity. It's a liberating... Literally, when people kind of look back to the 1960s and the drug culture, they kind of see it as an opening of the new world, whereby shows like this and various other things in society can be traced back to. But that same event happened with the Renaissance, and it was this discovery that all of a sudden there was this knowledge which was deemed to be so important and so interesting that people went berserk over it and still do.
It's kind of a very clever psychological process, isn't it? I mean, some people, there's a spiritual element to it, or you can call it a psychological element, but it's a very self-help. It's one of the very first kind of self-help books.
Yep.
So what has this got to do with Wolfram von Eschenbach's, Parsifal? What, he built that into the story?
Well, yes. Very briefly, there is one treatise, number 4, which is called the Cup, or the Monad.
The Monad, right.
And that cup is identified with the Grail. And the ancient Greeks knew this. They identified the Grail in the sky with the constellation Crater. And just from there, it all kind of like works together. Wolfram realized this Corpus Hermeticum. He realized there was this discussion about rebirth, remembering of past lives and all of that stuff. And he just wanted to work that into his story. So you've got an interesting merging of a family history, which he felt he had to really do much better than what would everybody else have been doing. And for that, he really used this 4 treaties and worked it in there.
Are we saying then that that this family, this is some kind of special family? Do they believe that they're a special bloodline?
I think they probably did, but I also think they considered the Grail to be a tremendous burden for them.
Really?
Yeah.
And they thought that the Grail was a specific thing?
Yes.
As we've been discovering, is pointing out that the story of Parsifal is actually based around a real family, a real royal family. And it's fascinating stuff, Philip. Before the break we were talking about the Grail. Most people see it as a cup. Obviously, the old Indiana Jones thing where they run in and there's the goblets there with all the jewels on. And of course, it happens to be the one that's poor-looking first-century clay thing or wooden thing that's, you drink from it, etc. But not most people don't realise that, it's actually spoken of as a stone, as a platter, as a great many things actually, isn't it?
Yeah. So Chrétien de Troyes leaves it unidentified. He just says this Grail stuff, Then they identify it Christian relic. Wolfram comes back and says, actually, it's a stone. It's a stone fallen from heaven. And he goes into extreme and interesting detail, which ties it back to why this Hermetica and this 4th treatise of the Hermetica is so important. Because what he's identifying is he's going back to the fall of mankind, this original sin, which is Christian. But then he puts the Hermetic spin on it. And he says, well, okay, we've fallen, but there is a way for us to ascend back to God. And for those who want to do that, God and the angels who didn't take sides in the battle between Lucifer and God placed this stone on earth, and that is the Grail. And people who will go in search of this will find this, and they will be able to reascend. So that's the moral lesson, which is both in the Hermetic treatise, specifically number 4, and which Wolfram works into his book. Now then the question is, should we all go looking for this stone, and if so, where is it? I'm kind of like dubious whether we should, and when people ask me that question, I kind of say, well, don't mix means and ends. Really, the stone in alchemical tradition is looked upon as the body, and it's like, okay, we are born, we need to find something to do with our lives. And that's very much what Wolfram tried to get out as well. And the story of the Grail, and specifically Percival, is like that. It is the knight who runs around aimlessly, doesn't really know what to do with his life, doesn't know this and that, comes within a very select group of people, these nobles, and makes a bit of a fool of himself. Hence why in the morning he kind of thinks, well, where did they all go? Well, they probably ran away, nothing wanted to do with you. 6 years later, he comes back, and all of a sudden they realize, oh, he actually has grown up. And it's that moral message which he tried to make into the story, because otherwise Wolfram would have just written another boring family history, and he wanted to make something more of that and get this moral message out.
What I'm fascinated by is why Wolfram was so interested in this particular family.
I think the likely answer is because he was paid to write this story.
By this particular family.
By this particular family.
Nothing changes, does it?
No.
So there's nothing special about them. Don't claim descent from Jesus or anything.
No, they are very ordinary, and this is actually one of the refreshing bits of Wolfram writing about this Grail story, because he does say that they have a physical object that they use within certain rites happening in the castle. And very much, I always compare it to a parent with a child. They look after this Grail cup and nourish it, and oh my God, we can't go on a holiday because the Grail will be all alone in the castle kind of situation. And then...
Get a Grail nanny.
Yeah. And then this goes through various generations. So the grandfather has done this, his life has been miserable. His son hasn't really made anything of his life because he's fascinated with this Grail care stuff. And then eventually they realize, just like a mother realizes about the child, okay, he's 55-year-old now, that's roughly the age when mothers leave. Let go of their children, exactly. And that happens with the Grail kind of stuff. So again, the moral message is not that he portrays the Aragon family as this really big, important tradition of bloodlines going back to the beginning of time, but actually a very human side of people who are distressed and try to get rid of this object, but also don't want to throw it away.
Sounds like medieval reality TV.
Yes.
Another thing that's interesting is this stone aspect, of course, which you've spoken at length about, but stones, actual physical, let's get physical for a minute and not just use the stone as a metaphor for the body or a metaphor for the philosopher's stone, etc. But people did actually collect stones, worship stones, hold them in high esteem. You know, the Sabiists would look to the stars, and etc., etc. So is there some element of that in this?
Yes, I put that in the book, saying, is there a Grail stone, is there a physical one? The answer is yes. Should we focus or bring it down to just one? I think the answer is no, because the Kaaba itself has got three important ones.
Which were claimed to have fallen from the heavens.
Exactly.
The fallen shining ones.
Exactly.
Skies, yeah.
And when you go to Mexico, you will come with villages whereby the Spaniards, when they came, the local Native Americans were actually worshipping stones as well, and said, these are our gods. When we communicate with the gods, it's via these stones. So again, the pagan element, I think, which Wolfram put in there, is the fact that there was this tradition of sacred stones. Again, probably coming from Spain, at that time Muslim, being reconquered by the Christians. And he just wanted to work that in there and try to make it more mundane, which I think was also the attraction of the Grail story in that day, that finally we have something which isn't so, nitpicking about a specific saint and whether or not he did this or that. It was a breath of fresh air. And this has been the attraction for the Grail for a very long period of time. It's just now it has been tracked down once again to Christianity and the very much treasure hunting Indiana Jones kind of style, which really the Da Vinci Code hasn't really changed at all. It's still very much the search for a treasure and getting the girl in the end sort of adventure.
I mean, the symbolism of the stones that fell from the sky, they are our kind of connection point to the heavens, aren't they? Which is why we sort of, held them in such high esteem.
And again, why he worked in that Hermetic treatise of the Grail in the sky, the constellation crater, because it brings that one in again.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's all absolutely fascinating. So what are you working on now?
Well, there is going to be a sequel to that, which is going to be Keepers of the Grail. I end that book by saying Wolfram stops his story in around 1137. Now, obviously, already when I said the Grail Cup in San Juan de la Peña turns up in 1399, there is a story of the Aragons post-1137. They went on. So that's going to be a sequel to that, but the one I'm working on now is actually called The Divine Lady. And it's about the apparitions of the Virgin Mary. But again, with it's actually quite similar to Servants of the Grail, whereby you've got something anomalous and people are wondering, what is it? And the church jumps in there and says, oh, it's the Virgin Mary.
Don't go any more. I know all about it. I'm actually in on this, so I know all about it. So don't go any more because we don't want to release that just yet.
Okay.
It is superb, and we will have you back on when The Divine Lady comes out.